Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's book launch, Islamic Paths to Modern Zanzibar. Thanks a lot to Bergen Global for hosting this event. To those of you who don't know, I'm Pelle Valentin Olsen, and I'm Associate Professor of Middle East History here at UIB. I'm extremely excited to about today's event. When a colleague and friend publishes a book, it is cause for celebration. When two friends and colleagues publishes books at the same time, it's cause for an even bigger celebration. And when two friends and colleagues publish books on a very similar topic and really push the field and the conversation forward, well, then it's really quite unique, I think, especially because both of you are here today. So I think we should really consider ourselves quite lucky to have such esteemed historians of modern Zanzibar here in Bergen with us today. Nathaniel Mathews is Associate Professor at Binghamton University in the US. He's a historian of East Africa and the Indian Ocean. And I actually moved from Binghamton to Bergen in August. And during my time in Binghamton, Nate became a dear friend and colleague. And when I arrived here in Bergen, Anna became a very dear friend and colleague. Yeah. Anna's professor of Middle East and African Islamic history here at UIB. Anna works on the Islamic history of the Western Indian Ocean. And we're here today to discuss Anna's and Nate's new books. Nate's book, and I think you can see the really extremely beautiful covers on the screens before you, right? Nate's book, Zanzibar Was a Country, Exile and Citizenship Between East Africa and the Gulf, was published this month. Congrats, Nate. Anna's book, Zanzibari Muslim Moderns, Islamic Paths to Progress in the Interwar Period, will come out in August, I believe. Congrats to Anna also. Today, I'll ask both Anna and Nate to briefly reflect a little bit on their books and also about what Zanzibar was and meant in the time periods that you're both studying and how that changed. After that, I'll invite you both to sort of reflect on each other's books a little bit and ask questions from each other. And finally, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. But Anna, perhaps we can start with you.
Thank you, Pelle, for agreeing to be moderator, and thank you, Nate, for coming. It's a pleasure to have one other modern Zanzibari historian here. So this book here, which for the time being only exists in this format, is in a way, it is the focus of the book has to do with development and progress and the Islamic ideas of how shall this little tiny place, after all, those of us who are historians of Zanzibar, we tend to think that it's the center of the world, but in reality, it's a relatively small island. How should this area or islands become better or improve? And this was a theme that was very much in the air from, let's say, from the late 19th century, at least, especially in the Middle East, and famously discussed in a lot of journals that came about with Arabic print and so on. But it's also a core theme in the 20th century. So it's something that stretches even up to today. There are all these different models. So how are we going to develop? The capitalist ideal comes as a suggestion. Later on, we see socialism. You have the whole debate over what about the nation state model. And you have very distinct Islamic models, which are the ones that I explore most. So what I'm proposing in this book is to say that at this period between the world wars, there emerged a kind of ideal, which I like to call then the Muslim modern. And I'm using this phrase specifically for those of you who are into that discourse, to avoid saying Salafi over here and Sufis over here, but there is just a middle way where modernity emerges in a sense, in Islamic modernity. So in this book, I try to portray the ways in which this group of progress-oriented Zanzibaris navigated the wide field of development models that they sort of had on the table. One of which was, of course, the colonial one, because at this time, at this point in time, Zanzibar was a protectorate, a part of the British Empire, but under the rule of the Busaidi Omani Sultanate, which it had been since 1890. And it was modern in the material sense. Other good colleagues of us have written about the cinemas, the newspapers, how the cars arrived, the first airplanes. So it's not like this is in no way like a backwater where you don't find these things. I find the interwar period particularly interesting in Zanzibar, but also in a sense in the whole Muslim world, and perhaps also in large parts of the colonized world. Because this is the time when we find the first generation who are like fully employed, salary men, mostly men, not only, but they had an employer in the colonial system against which they could petition, they could organize, they couldn't exactly negotiate. So we're not talking about trade unions here. And it's also the period of associations, where a lot of associations are formed. And in Zanzibar in particular, because of its very multi-ethnic nature, you find a wide range of associations and counter-associations, which reflects, again, this sort of pressure between the modern and the traditional within different communities. So I also try to explore a little bit what these developers are looking for. What do they want? And I try to identify at least one thing is education or knowledge, what they call proper knowledge, which is then not like magic or rituals that are in their eyes un-Islamic. There is also this quest for unity. If we could unify everybody under this modernity. If you ask about Zanzibar at this time, the particular thing in Zanzibar is that the status of slavery was relatively recently abolished. The status of slavery was abolished in 1907. The trade in slaves was abolished in 1897, I think. So it means that there is a population around that is also searching for identity, mostly through converting into Islam. So finally, I conclude in a little bit, I would say rather not very positive way, where I'm saying that these pathways that these modernists kind of signposted somehow led to the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964 and was then relegated to the attics of African nationalism and socialism. And it reappeared maybe in the 1990s as Salafism, if we want to see it that way. So my conclusion is more like if the intention was clear, the idea of whom constitutes this society was not clear. And I think that is something that resonates very clearly in Nate's book as well. So you can follow up.
Yeah, thank you for those remarks. A lot to grab onto, and thank you to you both for welcoming me here, and thank you to those of you in the audience who made time to come out today. I really appreciate it. The book is called Zanzibar Was a Country, Exile and Citizenship Between Africa and the Gulf. And I was joking with Anna before the event that my book is even though it came out a bit before hers, is actually a sequel to her book, in that I am looking specifically at post-World War II developments although I do offer some historical contextualization in the book. Most of the book is concerned with the impact of nationalist ideas in Zanzibar and the way in which Zanzibar's post-revolution exiles takes this idea of Zanzibar as a nation, as a country, and adapts it to their new homeland of Oman in the 1970s. And it's a story that really dates back to some of my first times visiting Oman. I was there to learn Arabic, and I think one of the first things that I encountered on the bus from Dubai to Muscat was the fact that the bus driver spoke Swahili. And so this piqued my interest, and then I had an opportunity to do a homestay with a family in Muscat, a Swahili-speaking family from the Kenya coast. And so this embarked me on this research project, placing diaspora and diasporas at the center of decolonization, the moment of African and Asian decolonization, a moment where different groups of actors are sort of attempting to wrestle with the implications of the nation state form. Once we implement the nation state, the modular idea of the nation, who belongs and who doesn't, who is the other of the nation, who is included. And so this has all sorts of practical implications for issuing passports, registering oneself as a citizen, monitoring the border of the nation, which has a territorial reality. And so in a sense, I feel like one thing that I'm doing, because I also work with this notion of development, is I'm analyzing the implication of the nation form as a model for development. And one of the ways that the diaspora of the Zanzibar Revolution is central to this story, it has to do with the kind of education that they received in Zanzibar beginning in the interwar period, in which those who were able to receive higher education were being trained to Zanzibarize the civil service in Zanzibar, to assume these roles in the colonial state. And so when the revolution of 1964 occurred, many of them were members of one political party that sort of lost out in the revolution, called the Zanzibar Nationalist Party. And they went into exile, and then eventually, after 1970, they came to Oman, a country that they had a sort of attenuated lineal or genealogical connection to, but a country that most of them had never visited before, and didn't speak the primary language of. These were Swahili speakers. And so, but in coming to Oman at a time in its own development where it was in need of indigenous professionals to take over the civil service and other functions of the state, the Zanzibari diaspora actually proved incredibly useful to the development project in Oman. And so these one-time exiles become Omani citizens, in spite of having been part of, a central part of the earlier project of making Zanzibar into a nation. Meanwhile, Zanzibar, as many of you in the audience know, becomes part of a larger union with Tanzania and becomes a subnational jurisdiction. So it is no longer a country. So the reason why I titled the book Zanzibar Was a Country, in reference to the nationalist struggle in Zanzibar, but also to the endurance, the perdurability of that idea beyond the borders of Zanzibar. And so I think that the notions of progress and development are really central here. You know, is there a specific form of Muslim modernity? And I think that this is a really interesting question to think about in terms of the role of the Gulf today. You know, when we think about Muslim modernities, people think about Dubai and Qatar and these places. A lot of times Oman is left out of the, you know, that conversation. But so yeah, this was sort of the story that I wanted to show in the book, or to tell in the book. And it was a story that came from my grounding with my own experiences with the Omani Zanzibaris in Oman. And it was also a story that wasn't really centralized in any archive, that existed only in fragments across different people's, sometimes memoirs they would make reference to, and a lot of, you know, just privately held memories that I collected during my dissertation research, originally oral life histories. So that's how the book came about, and I sort of take the story up into the 1990s and the 2000s, then to show the reemergence of connections between Oman and Zanzibar that drew on these earlier resonances, but also built off of the opening up of Tanzania and Zanzibar to tourism, that built off an increasing interest after 1990 in Omani heritage in Oman. And these processes all converge to bring a lot of the former exiles back to Zanzibar, along with their offspring and families, and stimulates this outpouring of writing about Zanzibar, about East Africa, from within the Omani national context, both by the ministry and by these former Zanzibar exiles, or Omani Zanzibaris, as I call them.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and this is why you're here, to stop me.
Yeah.
Because, you know.
No, fantastic. Before we open up for questions, I wanted to give you two the opportunity to comment on each other's work, right? Because you're both sort of the experts in this room. So, and just a couple of reflections on Nate's book,
Yeah.
and then after that you'll reflect on Anna's book. Perfect.
I'll be happy to. I mean, it's we have been discussing a little bit back and forth, Nate and myself, whether this is in fact a very unique history or not. It may not be, but because the story of the Omani migration to Zanzibar goes back centuries and centuries, at least to 1500 and before in Lamu and so on. Then you have the Busaidi Zanzibari state, then you have the colony, then you have the revolution, and you have the so-called returnees. These are then Omanis who have not been in Oman for centuries, some of them, others for decades, and they come at the exact moment in time when Oman is modernizing and developing and in need of professionals. And I'm thinking, is there any historical coincidence like that? I'm not sure, but what I wanted to say about your book is that you bring it out very clearly that this is, in fact, about the sort of how do individuals in this oceanic setting seek out the hubs of development. The Manga come to Zanzibar because it's the boom town. Then they return, not because it's booming, because they have to, but it happens to be booming. So I really appreciate that. And if I just may say one more thing that I really, really appreciate is the fact that you emphasize that those who left upon the revolution, they left as families. They were not young men fleeing persecution. I mean, they were also young men fleeing persecution, but there were whole families exodusing, which means that what you are able to bring in your book very, very well is also this as a female voice. The displaced are husbands, wives, and their children. And I don't know if you want to comment on it, if there's certain, because my question as a historian would always be, why don't you just forget about Zanzibar? You live in Oman. It's a rich country. I don't know if you want to reflect on that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the son of Ali Muhsin al-Barwani, who was, you know, one of the key members of the Zanzibar Nationalist Party and its de facto head. Ali Muhsin's son said to me, we were talking about Zanzibar, and he said, Zanzibar is not Zion. In other words, we remember it, but we don't have a project of sort of going back and creating a nation state there again. In fact, he actually refused to actually return and visit the islands based on his own political principles. He said he couldn't. And there's more than a few former Zanzibaris who feel that way. But in terms of the uniqueness of the story, I guess I'll leave that to you readers. I definitely see a lot of resonances with other stories of post-colonial migration. We could talk about the retornados from Africa to Portugal in the 1970s. There's a great book that's just come out called Post-Colonial People by Christopher Coulter that deals with a lot of the same themes that I do. You know, it's not an exact analogy, obviously, because it's not like Oman is fighting some sort of insurgency to maintain its colonial empire in East Africa. That doesn't happen. And arguably, the Omani Empire really ceased to exist after 1856. I mean, we can debate that, but that's the argument that I would make. But in terms of the you know, the experience of the Zanzibaris in the revolution, and I see this as comparative to similar sorts of situations as with you know, Asians in Uganda. We could talk about ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. You know, I think that actually diaspora groups would be the framework that I would prefer to adopt, the comparative framework. I think diaspora groups were uniquely affected by the discourse and the ideology of nationalism. And they have to make sometimes difficult choices under pressure to sort of choose one homeland or the other. You know, you can't maintain these transnational connections anymore, although some people do, and they persist in maintaining these, actually. And funnily enough, the prosperity of the Omani developmental state in the 70s and 80s allows some returnees to maintain a sort of transregional lifestyle, especially if they work for the state oil company, because the state oil company has a policy where you're essentially, what is it, like you're on for, it's a 30-90 schedule. So you're on for 3 months and you're like at the site deep in the desert, but then you have a month off and you don't work. And so what people would do is they would go and work, you know, in the desert at an oil well or whatever. Then they would actually go back to East Africa where they were maintaining a family. This 30-90 schedule by the Petroleum Development of Oman allowed some people to maintain these types of transregional or transnational connections. But there was pressure. There was intense pressure to give up second passports, to conform to some imagined idea that all citizens of the nation were to hold in common certain beliefs, certain forms of dress. And I think we see this all around the Indian Ocean. And You know, it's the xenophobic edge, if you will, of the national projects. I think you find it pretty much everywhere where there is a process of consolidating new nation states. Yeah, and in terms of the family thing, we talked about it, we discussed it. It was really important for me to bring that out. Also because Zanzibari women were very active in the Omani workforce in the early years of post 1970. And they were also very active in diaspora in the UK and in the Gulf. And a part of this was out of necessity. You know, sometimes the income that the spouse, the wife is bringing in is the only family income for this for a family who is kind of teetering on the edge of precarity. And so women sometimes are forced into the workforce, actually in a place and time where their Omani or Emirati peers are not working. So that's another interesting dynamic at play here.
So, Nate, before I ask you to briefly comment on Anna's book and what it made you, or just your reactions, I wanted to ask you to just very briefly, for the sake of the audience, perhaps tell us a little bit about the numbers, like after the revolution, because not everyone is familiar with the history, right? How many people are we actually talking about?
That's a great question, and it's contested. And I probably have to look back at I don't have a total number of people. If you look at the UNHCR records, you see moments where close to 5,000 people in the year after the revolution are leaving through the official auspices of the UNHCR and the Red Cross. But I can only assume that there's a much larger portion that are making unauthorized voyages out. So it is very difficult. You see a massive reduction in the numbers of certain communities. Certainly the Arab community in Zanzibar and in Pemba is drastically reduced. And this also on the Omani side, there's also no reliable statistics. I tried to go to the Ministry of Interior. You know, I think that they actually do have the record somewhere, but they would never make those public. And there's never been any sort of census where, you know, Zanzibaris are designated. I think there was an estimate that as much of 1/10 of the population of Oman has some sort of East African roots. Sorry, I think actually one researcher said up to 1/3 of the population, has East African roots. But you know, between 1/10 and 1/3, that's a huge difference. So I don't know that there's any reliable numbers, but we are talking about probably maybe up to 100,000 people who leave Zanzibar, let's say in the decade after the revolution.
Which is quite a lot.
Yeah. Considering it's about 500,000 people on the islands, or 600,000 maybe. Okay, is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's been my turn, but it's my turn to ask you. Anna, this is an amazing book. It made me think about a lot of different things. The concept of modernity comes up, how people define modernity. And I wanted to ask you, because it is a book about being modern and the notion of progress and development. I wanted to ask about the vehicle that some of your actors identify as the sort of the way to deliver this development, right? Because you know, when you get to some of my historical and social actors, you see that they are invested in the nation as the vehicle of the development of the whole society, the progress of the whole society. But it seems there's some ambiguity in the interwar period And we talked about how this is a period when the Ottoman Empire has fallen and given way to Turkey as a nation state, you know, the formation of Saudi Arabia. Who or what are your actors taking as the vehicle to deliver this development? Is it actually the nation, or is it left kind of open? Or you know, how do you see that?
That is a very interesting question, Nathan, and it's also something that I struggled a bit with too, because it's often assumed that Islamic modernism is the father of the nation. You know, from modernity and modernism comes nationalism. That's like, okay, this is how it goes. But it doesn't really look like that, because let me start with the vehicles instead, because what they are first and foremost looking at is education. You know, knowledge is like the number one. But it's nowhere really said that it has to be a Zanzibari education. See what I mean? It is knowledge in its form out there. And when I say out there, it's in the journals, you know, Al-Manar, Al-Fat, all these ones that are circulating, but also the locally produced one, like Sheikh Al-Amin Al-Masroui's various newspapers, and also the Zanzibari ones. And there's continuous calls for this. We need more education. We need better education. We need education for the girls. There is no sort of resistance against this, but it's not formulated in terms of the nation. It is said that if we are educated, our sometimes watan, sometimes taifa, sometimes we the Muslims, and sometimes just we as a undefined entity, we will rise through education. So it's kind of open to interpretation, really, who are the we that will rise in this manner. And the other vehicle that that is very much there is this tendency to form associations for this and that purpose, Jamiyat anything, everything good, khair, so on. But there is no Jamia that says Jamiyat Zanzibar. See? There it's either ethnic, like Comorians, Hadramis from the interior, Hadramis from the coast. Of course, they had to have different association. Same with the manga and so on. So I am really not sure how to interpret it, because obviously nationalism is prominent, let's say in Egypt and India, both of which are very closely associated with Zanzibar at the time. So there's no reason why it's not there. Maybe it implicitly is, and I'm just not pinpointing it. And of course, in some other circles, it is explicitly said, this is Wataniya. But whether or not they mean that it is the nation as such that is modernizing, or if it is more on the level of the people, the population, us who are here, we are modernizing. There is, of course, the anti-colonial element, but that is voiced in Islamic terms as well, saying we want Islamic education. We can't send our kids to Makera because they will come back not good.
Secular,
Yeah.
Egypt, maybe. Saudi Arabia, yes. Because that is like the new nation. I was surprised when working on this book how much esteem Saudi Arabia, or how much hope was connected to the rise of Saudi Arabia. Like, this is where we can build the universities. the Islamic universities. Of course, it was not in existence then, but in a way it came true, right?
Mm.
That this is where you can go to get a proper Islamic education.
Mm.
So hence my conclusion that I'm thinking it never reached the nation level at this point in time, but it comes in full force even slightly later.
Yeah, and this is one of the I think one of the most fascinating things about your book. You place at the center this I don't know if you use this term, but I see him as a rooted cosmopolitan, Burhanam Pelle, Sheikh Burhanam Pelle, who is a Zanzibari, yes, or lived his whole life in Zanzibar, but he's Comorian. But he is, as a member of the ulama, he is also, fluent in Arabic and invested in this, raising the level of Islamic knowledge and education on the islands. And I guess that's one of the ironies of the story in Zanzibar is that the potential is there for Islam to serve as the glue of the nationalist project, but ethnicity and race sort of end up trumping those ideas. Burhanam Pelle didn't identify as a Zanzibari, no? Or was he ever explicit about that? But he nevertheless, culturally, is a part of the cultural sphere that underlay later articulations of what Zanzibari nationalism could mean, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Shall I make a comment?
Please.
I think that is one of the things, or one of the aspects of Islamic reform, whether you want to call it modernism, Salafism, Wahhabi, anything you want. If you give up your previous ethnic, cultural, habitual practices and join in, this could be the national project. And many of the Comorians did, but it was not like obvious that you should give up all these habits of the Comorian weddings and so on in order to make this great equalizer kind of thing. So maybe that's why that there is certainly the potential, but it's difficult to find the level, like the least common denominator, where people don't, or individual groups don't have to give up too much, because otherwise they are no longer what they were.
That's interesting.
So there's maybe that's the issue here. But it's also surprising to me.
Yeah.
Because there are other examples in the Middle East where it worked perfectly fine. I mean, to an extent.
To an extent.
At least to the extent that nations were formed.
Yeah.
So I think I really want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. So if we have time at the end, you guys will get to ask each other questions again. And I also have a couple of questions, but first I think we should open it up to the audience. Are there any questions about to Nate or Anna?
Comments are okay.
Protests are also welcome.
Yeah. Observations. Yeah.
Not young. I just wonder. Oh, thank you. Is this for me? Oh, yeah. I talked to some Omanis once, and they said that in order to have progress, we will leave the Swahili culture behind. Have you experienced that? And is that Oman's future in that way in order to get progress, I think?
Oh, yeah. That's by the way, should we collect a few and then
maybe that's a good
we
idea.
can answer
we
if
can do that.
there's-
Yeah.
I will remember.
Yeah.
I have a lot to say on this actually.
Yeah, I also have a question to Nathaniel. regarding the community you just elaborated about before, but how do you frame the community that you work with? Like, what makes a candidate to the returnees exactly? And also maybe a little bit, I don't know if you have time, if there are no other questions, but about the sources, what do you choose to work with?
I think actually maybe we could ask you both to reflect
That
on
could
sort of
be,
like the sources and
yeah.
archives for
Yeah.
modern Zanzibari history. You know, that's one of the questions I had. So yeah. Should we take one more question? There is another question. Yes.
Hello, and thank you very much to Anna and Nate for presenting your books at this launch. I have a question about the history of intermarriage in this region. Could you say a little bit more about that? Thanks.
Maybe we should. Yeah.
Might need another hour on that last
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, so I'll just start with this sentiment that you heard from some Omanis, which I also have heard, and you know, there's actually been editorials in Omani newspapers condemning the speaking of Swahili in public places as anti-national. But what is, I think, significant is that every time there has been an editorial like that, there has been a response from a Zanzibari writer or intellectual. And I'll present some of the arguments that they make. One of the arguments they make is that, well, first and foremost, we have a right to be here. We are Omani by ethnicity. Okay, just because we were in East Africa for a sojourn period of time, lasted hundreds of years, a little more than a sojourn, but you know, that's how they portray it. We have as equal right to Omaniness as anyone else. And then they will talk about the history of Oman in East Africa, which I think a lot of Omanis, maybe this is changing now with the increase in heritage and museums and everything, but a lot of Omanis, you know, in the 1970s and 80s were not all that much aware of if they didn't have a personal family connection too. You know, the idea to, you know, you have to leave behind Swahili to become, I don't know, for Oman to progress it's a bit of an ironic sentiment, given how important Swahili speakers have been to the development and the progress of, especially the early Omani state, because I think one of the contexts that it's important for all of us to realize is that in 1970, Oman was, by any development indicator, an underdeveloped country. And that meant a dearth of educated professionals, right? So where do you get a large portion of educated professionals to take over the functions of the state that were previously occupied by, say, British expatriates? Well, it was the Zanzibaris. I mean, it was the Omani diaspora, right? Because there were other branches of the Omani diaspora other than these in East Africa. But a large portion of that labor came from the returnees. So I think that there's a way that their material presence in the state early on and their contributions that they made. I mean, literally a returnee was one of the people who set up the Ministry of Health, you know, and I mean, there's many examples in the book of the role of returnees. So I think that is an expression of probably ignorance of these dynamics and the role that the returnees played. And it's also, I think, a reflection of, you know, these processes that we've been discussing, the homogenization of language that happens as a result of needing to define the boundaries between an authentic national and somebody who is outside that concept. And, you know, speaking Swahili, oh, you don't speak Arabic, there's an assumption then kind of made that you must be outside the Omani national concept. And I think that this ignores a large part of Oman's history. You know, we're talking about Omanis who have made very significant contributions to Swahili literature, Swahili poetry. So anyway, I think I can stop there. Yeah.
Maybe if you don't mind, I can start addressing the issue of intermarriage,
Mm.
and then we can maybe get to the identity question or the categorization questions that you raised.
Yeah.
But I will do it a little bit more from the Hadrami point of view, and I won't take long. But of course, intermarriage is core to the whole rise of Swahili identity in a way over centuries and centuries and centuries.
Yeah.
So that's like an established fact. But then exactly in the 20th century, that's when you get this, well, you see the same in Indonesia and I presume also maybe Malaysia, this debates over who is marriageable for whom, because that's exactly what I mean by this, which of your habits and rituals should you leave behind to enter into this least common denominator of Islamic unity and modernity, right? So concepts of kafah, for example, becomes much more debated, exactly because the pressure is on to sort of intermarry within what then presumably will be a nation and leave behind lineage, whether you're Ahl Bayt or not, all these issues. So, and this is exactly what's happening in Zanzibar as well. It becomes very hotly contested exactly in this period. And it's also what I mean by, it's like this least common denominator is not found. There is no point of equilibrium here where you could say, okay, we all agree, we do it this way now in this place. So that also goes to the identity question in a way that it's doesn't really get properly defined. Regarding intermarriage, I'm sure you have a lot to say about the Omani situation as well.
Yeah, I think that this idea of intermarriage is extremely important to Swahili self-conceptions and certainly to the Afro-Arabs who are at the center of this book. And that speaks to your question about framing community. But once you sort of go beyond that kind of surface level, you find many different opinions and permutations, and I think historical change in the practice of intermarriage. I think that, for example, early Omani migrants to the coast, the Swahili coast, did intermarry a lot more than those who came later, in part because subsequent generations were wealthier. They could afford to bring spouses from the homeland, and they became more, you could say, caste-like in their marriage practices as they became wealthier, which I think is a pretty common trajectory in terms of intercultural contact and intermarriage. I remember talking to a lady, returnee lady, who I believe it was her aunt, who was an Omani, married a Shirazi man, which at the time, we're talking about the mid 20th century, she expressed that was unacceptable. So among certain Omani clans, they privileged endogamy with other Omani clans. So even though the ideal of intermarriage and cultural pluralism was there, the actual private family practices were more endogamous. So I think this can vary a lot, and this bears on how I frame the subjects of the book and the whole idea of diaspora. I really I struggled with this a lot, partly because the story is in fragments that I had to piece together, and partly because I think that when we think of the word diaspora, it can become a shorthand for community, when actually, what diaspora often does, it's more of an existential condition that fractures people along different lines in terms of socioeconomics, passports, nationality status that you can make a claim to. And the focus, the particular boundaries, the communal boundaries, I think are at the center of my work. I tried to actually work with the concept of generation to define a sort of bounded group of people in a more meaningful way. So I tried to look at a generation or several generations of Afro-Arabs beginning in really interwar Zanzibar, and then taking that story up through the nationalist era. But it's hard because there are different names for these people in the historical record. You know, sometimes in their own self-conception, they will be very self-consciously identify as Zanzibari. In other times, they are making claims on Omaniness from the diaspora to try to get Omani nationality. In other times and places, they are very ostentatiously identifying as Arab rather than Zanzibari. And then, you know, the returnee experience is obviously not just limited to those who came from Zanzibar, but includes all of East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, even Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. So yeah.
There's a question about archives and sources
Mhm.
that while you both think about what you want to say about that, perhaps we can see if there's another final question, perhaps from the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you, Professor Anna, Professor Nata. As an insider from the community, I have many questions to ask, but I'll keep the rest of the questions when we meet in person later on. But my concern is about the future of these communities that you're talking about, you know, especially to Nathaniel, these returnees from Zanzibar to Oman and the future generations. How do they consider themselves? Do they continue to relate to their Zanzibari history? Or is there a point in time when this history is completely cut off and they become completely like Omanis now?
That's a great question.
Yes. Do you want to start reflecting on sort of archives and sources?
I think we should.
And then we'll, that you used for your book.
Okay, we can do that first. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, right. So actually I was reflecting about this is my third book on this kind of area or this Islamic history of East Africa anyway. And the two earlier ones were extremely translocal. So in that case, the sources were like everywhere. I was in Madagascar, in Comoros, in Hadramaut, and up and down the coast. For this book, all the sources are from Zanzibar. All of them, but they are, quite a lot of them are private papers, which I was fortunate to read in the home of the late Malim Idris Muhammad, especially the private papers of Burhan Pelle. So that's kind of how it came about that I started to read it and what's this guy, because he's not so well known as some of the other more sort of famous sheikhs. And then the rest of it is quite simply from the Zanzibar Institute of Archives and Records, the National Archive of Zanzibar, entirely, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So that's almost like unusual for me too. It's the opposite experience of you. It was not particularly fragmented. If you want to know how their employment went, their employment records are there. If you want to know about these associations, it's there.
Right.
Yeah.
Did your project begin with an interest in telling the story of Burhan Pelle, and then you sort of adopted this framework of Muslim moderns, or did you have an idea of like, I want to write on the relationship between Islam and modernity? Here's an exemplar, you know.
You know what fairly quickly was clear to me was that he was a good friend of Sheikh Al-Amin Al-Masroui, who is one of these famous well-known modernists, modernizers. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, why? So he, who lived in Kenya, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Burhan, he lived in Zanzibar, and I said, okay, why? What is this relationship, and how are the two of them thinking together, if you like? And I didn't find very much of correspondence between them, but there is a little bit. And it was enough to sort of trigger my interest in how was this formulated, and by a Comorian Zanzibari, kind of, not to say of all things, but you could have maybe expected that it was some of the graduates of the Bakathir Madrasa or something. But here is somebody who is a teacher in the secular school in Zanzibar, right? And so it's a whole other trajectory.
Right.
That was, but still a poet, still a member of the Sufi Shadiliya. So there's this, it was, I think my interest was more piqued by the fact that it's not clear cut.
Yeah.
It's not at all clear cut. This man is many things.
Yeah.
And his companions are also many things. So yeah.
I love that. We contain multitudes.
Yes.
To address this very pertinent question, I think from my perspective, and I'll just reflect on the last couple of years. I was in Muscat for not this Eid, but the 2022, I guess. And Zanzibaris were everywhere. I mean, this sort of trans-regional sphere of interaction, it continues, or it was revived after 1990 and has only been picking up. And then I went to Zanzibar this past summer, and who do I run into but like a bunch of Omani friends of mine who are there. The Zanzibaris have given them the name Wa June July, like the people of June July, the people who come when the weather is good in Zanzibar, essentially, to visit relatives. And some of them have invested in businesses and built homes. And so if anything, the wealth the wealth accumulation that the returnees have been able to do as a result of living in Oman, a relatively wealthy country, have enabled them to kind of continue these strategies of mobility, or the practices of mobility, I should say, to the present day. And I think that there is there's two dynamics that I would bring out. One I was talking about earlier with Anna, and that is the people who were children at the time of the revolution, maybe just 1, 2, up to maybe 10 years old, who were kids and left Zanzibar, and may have heard conversations about the revolution as whispers between adults when they were growing up, and became curious. And then when there was an opportunity to go back to Zanzibar, they went back. Some of them actually had been leading the way in writing history and memoir about Zanzibar from the Omani context. So I think that they're extremely important to the maintenance of this connection. And then there's an even younger generation, even my generation and even younger, who are visiting East Africa for the first time, and realizing that they have this sort of heritage connection, and are just sort of interested in preserving that. So that there were predictions, for instance, that Swahili speaking would eventually die out in Oman. But I think that the younger generation, even though they may not be, and they may not speak Swahili in the same way that their elders did, they will maintain an interest in this East African connection. And as long as they can go back to Zanzibar and Mombasa and these places, I think that connection will be preserved going forward.
And they will speak Ki Omani.
Yeah, they will speak, and it's interesting, the practice of Swahili, how it changes in diaspora, because I think it does become, the generation who grew up hearing Swahili in the home, but not necessarily like learning it formally. Okay, they don't really read Swahili, but they can understand it perfectly and converse in it if necessary. So, and the culture of sending like WhatsApp voice notes,
Yeah.
you know, has actually enabled that to persist. Swahili as a kind of oral second language or a heritage second language that may be spoken in the home, or among a certain in-group. But it, you know, obviously Swahili doesn't have an official status in Oman, you know, even as a second language or something. That's an interesting question. I don't know if Oman will ever, you know, officially designate Swahili as a Omani language. That would be fascinating.
So I don't know how strict we have to be about time, but we are actually officially out of time.
Oh.
So
Okay.
perhaps we can continue the conversation with snacks outside. And thank you all for coming. And I hope you'll join me in giving a big round of applause for Nate and Anna, who've written really beautiful books.